Today we're going to install a BLTouch bed leveling sensor on an Ender 3 V2. Hello everyone, Chris here, and probably a lot of you are thinking right now, why are we installing a BLTouch on a Creality Ender 3 version 2? There's already a lot of great content on the version 2, and it has been out for a couple of years now. But when I got my version 2, I was pretty much over the whole Ender 3 platform. I have a lot of the original Ender 3s, and we've done a few things with them, made modifications, turned them into other things, so I really didn't see a need to do a lot of content on the version 2. It's a more polished version of the Ender 3, and it's not necessarily as easy to mod as the original, and it did cost just a little bit more. So I focused mainly on the first gen. But recently, I've been getting a lot of questions on the version 2, and I think that's because we're starting to see the price drop, and we're starting to see a lot of returns and maybe second-hand version 2s where people want to modify them and get them up and running. Again, the version 2 might not be as easy to modify as some of the other versions. Also, I have seen these locally recently. I've even seen recently at my local Micro Center store, you can get these for around 200 bucks. I think when it came out, it was about 250, so really not a bad deal for a little more polished Ender 3. Also, a lot of my content comes straight from the comments on the videos, people that are struggling with modifications or getting their printer up and running. And I have seen a few more questions on the Ender 3 V2. So I thought we'd tackle some of those issues today, maybe do a couple of these videos. A lot of this is going to be focused around the firmware. This Creality board doesn't handle the firmware the same way as a lot of the other stock boards, so I thought we'd run through adding the BLTouch first, just to get a lay of the land and see how some of this stuff works. This is my original V2, by the way. I haven't changed it in any way. It has pretty much all the original parts and the original firmware. Not much has changed. So I thought we'd go ahead and take a look, see where we stand, and then figure out where we are almost 2 years later with our Ender 3 V2. So let's check it out. So let's start here by taking a look at the BLTouch that I'm using. Now this is the Creality BLTouch kit. It's almost $50. You can find it a little cheaper if you look around, but it comes with some extra stuff that a regular BLTouch wouldn't. You do get 3 different types of metal mounting bracket. This is the one for the V2 that we're going to be using today. This is for version 1. So you might take that into account if you're not necessarily using a V2 directly. You could also always 3D print this part if you wanted to. It does come with some screws. Of course, a genuine BLTouch. There's lots of different ones of these touch sensors. Make sure it is an actual one. You should have a serial and model number on the back if it is genuine. The cable that it comes with is pinned out with a JST connector that will go directly on Creality board, so you wouldn't have to make one of these if you bought the kit rather than just the sensor. You also do get a replacement pin for the sensor. I have had to replace these before. I paid around $15 a piece. So this right here might be the reason just to go for the kit rather than the sensor on its own. So one of the biggest issues with the Creality Ender 3 V2 was the firmware. Directly out of the box, the first versions that they tried didn't all work correctly. There were a few holes. It didn't respect a lot of the G-code commands. So let's just start out by seeing what version we have. Again, this was one of the really early on V2s. We're currently at firmware version 1.02. And I seem to remember that being the number that everyone had problems with. Now the version number doesn't tell the whole story in many cases. It could be an earlier version. I've seen some that say version 0.6. They're actually newer than this version. So keep that in mind. It should be more obvious as we work through this video. We'll tackle all that firmware stuff in a minute. Let's go ahead and get the sensor set up, get all the hardware stuff out of the way. Again, I am using the Creality kit, so I'm going to use their mounting bracket. Make sure you get this on the right way. It is really easy to get this flipped over, and your sensor's not going to work correctly if it does get flipped over. You want it mounted just like this. There's a little longer arm here that goes down. We're using M3 by 6mm screws. They give you 4 of them to attach them. I'll go ahead and put the bracket on first. Got one screw up there, and then another down below. Then I want to go ahead and put the wires on the sensor. It is kind of hard to get the wires on here after it's been mounted. It's a little tight. This is a 5-pin. It's the smaller end on the cable that comes ready-made in the kit. It just goes on the sensor like this. And then you can slide that wire in between the bracket. This bracket is threaded in these two holes. You can just put the screws in from the bottom. And there we go. That's all there is to mounting it. Now, depending on the bracket you use, the metal ones that come in the kit should be relatively straight, but make sure that this is completely vertical. If it's skewed at all, they don't work very well. You also need to snake your wires through this wire loom. I've already done that here. I'll show you a little bit more when we go to the control box. Just cut these zip ties. You should be able to feed it through relatively easily. It'll follow the same path. If you have the kit, they give you a lot of extra slack. It's easy to install. But now let's go to the board side. Now we need to gain access to the board so you can plug this sensor in. There's one screw right here you need to remove, and then a couple on the bottom. We'll remove these 3. That wire loom can be somewhat challenging to push it through there. You could snake it through with something. I usually just push the wire halfway through and then bunch it up from this side, and then it's usually the plug is close enough that you can just reach in and grab it. There are 2 of them to keep it extra protected. But once you've got the wire loom sorted, your probe is going to go in this 5-pin connector right here. While you have this open, it is important to note which board you have. There's a couple of different types that come with the version 2. It should be right underneath the Creality here. We'll just move the ribbon cable back. Ours is a 4.2.2. There is also a 4.2.7, and it's going to be different firmware. So take a look while you're in here. You need to know which one. And now we can put everything back together. This should be all the hardware changes we have to make. So the hardware's done, sensor's on, we ran the wires, we added a couple more zip ties. That was the easy part. Now we have to figure out the firmware. So the biggest issue that I see on the Ender 3 V2 over and over is the firmware. It didn't start out so great. They have a different type of screen on here that has a little fancier UI that makes it a bit more difficult to change. It really just runs Marlin at the heart, but that screen again makes it a little more interesting. So you have to have firmware for the screen as well. Now for this video, I'm just going to follow what Creality does. They have a lot newer versions now. It should work just fine, but I would like to get to the point where we could use full-blown Marlin, use all of the features, and still maintain our screen. That will be for another video, but let's try to go the Creality way and just see how it turns out. Creality does have a download page for most of their printers nowadays. This is the one for the V2. But there's several out there. You can see the different boards, 422 like the one we have, 427. They have a Marlin 201. This appears to be Marlin 2082. I'm not sure what the difference is. But you also see this Ender 3 series touchscreen firmware. We don't have a touchscreen. I don't know if that's a typo or if this controls multiple screens, not sure, but it should be the files that we need if we have to flash that firmware. So this is more of a fact-finding mission at this point. What is this version? Do we have to have one of these to use a BLTouch or filament detection? So let's just find out. They're simple bin files. So let's grab this GD version. We'll start there. Now you will need some sort of micro SD card to be able to flash this firmware. We just have to have something to put the bin files on. It needs to be 32 gig or less so that we can format it FAT32. I've got my card loaded on the computer. I'm just going to right click, hit format, just make sure it says FAT32, and we'll format to make sure we have everything cleaned up so it's going to work for the flash. And that file we just downloaded, it downloaded as a zip file. I'm just going to right click, extract all. We'll open up that file. And here's our bin file. Now, from my understanding, it really doesn't matter what these are named, just as long as the file you're flashing next isn't named the same as the last one. It won't pull the same file in twice. So I'm just going to shorten this a bit, just so we know it's that GD version that we found on the site. And let's put an A at the end. In case we have to do it multiple times, we'll know which one we used. So there's our bin file. And I'm just going to right click and copy this and put it on our SD card. And basically all you have to do to flash it, remember that board is upside down in there, we just saw that earlier, so we'll put our SD card in upside down. We'll load the SD card with the bin file. Remember, this is just the bin file for the board, not the screen. And we'll power the printer up. It took a little longer than usual to boot, but the screen did come up. It does look just a little bit different than the previous version. We'll go into info. You can see now we're on version 104EN, English. And everything on the screen looks proper. So I shouldn't have to, at this point, flash the firmware on the screen. The question is now, does this include firmware for the BLTouch and or filament runout, if that's what you want to use? Let's head into prepare and just see what's in there. It's your usual stuff. Auto home, disable steppers, set offsets, your filament settings, but there's nothing in here about auto level. If you head into control, there's nothing in here either. So the GD, I'm guessing, is the general distribution firmware, the stuff that comes on all the new Ender 3 V2s. We have to use one of the older versions to get our BLTouch to be supported. So let's go back to the computer. And we'll just grab this Marlin 201-422 mainboard BLTouch. Let's download that one. Same process, we'll extract all. And in here, you have multiple options for the firmware that you want to use based on the components that you've added or what you'd like to do with these upgrades. So the file naming on the site is a little misleading, but it's good to see that they have the newer versions for all the different components that you might like to add. They have the one for the BLTouch, the adapter board. You might have seen me do that in the past, where you have to have that adapter to use the sensor. You've got filament detect, if you want to add that. You've got the original with the screen code. So we can go in here, this DWin set, we'll see that down the line. That's the code that goes on the screen. They've even got one for a taller Z height, 350. And then the one we need, BLTouch, no adapter board firmware. It is Marlin 208. So we're going to take this file. Let's copy that, and we'll put it on our SD card. I'll just get rid of that GD file, and then we'll shorten this name a bit. And again, I'll just put an A on the end so I know which one I'm using. And let's go back to the printer. Again, I've loaded the SD card with the new bin file. We'll power up. And after we've come back up, you now see we have a leveling menu. We don't want to hit it quite yet. We have some other things to set up, but I think we're on the right track, and we've learned what those different files do. Now with your new BLTouch, it's going to home Z for you. You no longer need the Z end stop, so we're going to need to remove that. It's just 2 screws here on the side. You can probably slide it down if you want, but I'm just going to unplug it. We'll take it off. And as long as your sensor isn't throwing any errors, it's cycled properly when you boot it up, the easiest way to test to make sure it's working now that your Z end stop is off is to just auto home. So I'll go to prepare and hit auto home. It's going to do X, then Y, then it'll use Z safe homing to come to the center of the bed, probe, and that's how it'll know where your Z is. We probed once successfully. It's going to do it a second time to make sure. Now it should think it's at Z0. And that's where the offsets come in. I think this is the most confusing part about installing one of these sensors. So with the stock firmware, we're actually lacking a few things. It's there, it's just not in the menu. We actually need to set the offsets for X and Y where this probe is. You'll notice that it's not in the center of the bed. The offset is what's going to get it there. So basically what we need to know is where the probe tip is and where the nozzle tip is. So here in the X, we're setting it about 45. It's really hard to see the probe end over there from this angle, but in the Y, we're setting it about an 8. And even though it's not available on the menu, you can still cable up to your computer, USB, and use something like Pronterface to interface with the firmware. So we'll just connect up. This one is running at 11.5200 baud rate, and you can run an M503. This will give you a lot of the settings that are set in the firmware. Your Z probe offsets are set with an M581. We can set the Z offset on the screen, but not X and Y. We're currently set to a -50 and a -10, X and Y. That's probably close enough, but you did see we were a little bit off. I would rather them be a little more exact. So I'm going to do an M851, X -45, Y -8. They're in the negative because the probe is to the left of the nozzle and to the front of the nozzle. If they were to the right or behind, that would be positive. So we can hit enter, and then you can do an M500 to save that to EEPROM. Now when we do our auto home, you can see now the BLTouch is much closer to the center of the bed. So that's one problem solved. Next up, I like to get the level as close as I can before we actually do the auto level. This bed is still riding on the springs and you have adjustment knobs. So let's get the manual setting as close as we can. I'm going to go to Control and go to Temperature and heat the bed to my normal printing temperature. I usually print PLA on a printer like this. So we'll set it to 60. We'll wait for that to heat up, but we'll go back to Prepare. Now that we've done our auto home, I'm just going to go to Move. We're at 9.9. I'm going to take that down to 0. So at 0, you notice it's still very far off the bed. That's because of that Z offset. We'll set that in a minute. That's for the probe. On some printers, including this one, you can go into the negative. That disables software in-stops, and that can be somewhat dangerous. You can collide. But since we're allowed to do that here, I'm going to get a piece of paper, and I'm going to move Z into the negative until the nozzle just touches. And we're setting right about a -3.0. Now remember that number because that's going to be really close to what your Z offset is. But you can actually set your Z offset on the fly on this machine. That's the process we're going to use. But keep that in mind. And since we're at the bed and we're heated up, I'm just going to hit Disable Steppers. Now, this might cause your Z to drop. It shouldn't if your Z is set up correctly, if your machine is set up correctly. I'm just going to rough in the bed level. I'm going to go around to all the corners now that it's up to temp. And I'm going to use my paper and get those bed leveling knobs as close as I can. I want the nozzle just touching that paper. And after I've gone around a few times, I'm relatively sure this is semi-accurate with the manual mode. And you don't absolutely have to do this. The BLTouch will compensate for some of it, but the closer your bed is before you auto level, the better it's going to be after. So I highly suggest you do these steps first. You could even do these right before you start this whole process. It would be even easier since you already have a Z end stop. Remember, we're not trying to get this whole thing accurate as far as the sensor is concerned. We're tramming to the tool head. We just want our bed plane to be as level to that nozzle tip as we can be. Now that I have that roughed in, we can go back to the main screen and we can just run the level sequence. This is going to run around the bed after it auto homes and probe several spots. I believe stock, it's 16 points. Our level sequence is complete, and that sequence should save it to EEPROM. You can verify that by going back to something like Pronterface. The M503 again will give you all of those points that it measured. You can also use M420 commands to display this and to set the mesh. So the level is complete. We've got our X and Y offset set so that we're in the center of the bed. Now we need to set that Z offset. And that's the difference in between the probe point and the nozzle. So the probe is going to touch the bed at a much lower spot than the nozzle would be. So you have to compensate with that offset. On the V2 stock firmware that we loaded, we can do that directly from the screen, and I like to do that just on the fly while it's printing. Most of the time, I still just use Tom's bed leveling test that's been around for years. It works pretty well. You don't even have to print the whole thing. You can have it dialed in long before it's complete. So we'll slice this, put it on the SD card, and fire it up on the printer. So our bed's clean, our filament's loaded. I'm going to go ahead and go to print, run that bed leveling test, and then you can go to tune while it's running. And this Z offset is what you want to adjust. You can see that the filament is really far away from the bed surface as we start out here. Then we can start adjusting our Z offset. Remember before we got all the way down to 3.0 before the nozzle touched. So I'm all the way down to -2 right now. We're starting to get just a little bit better. At 2.95, we're almost completely stuck. At 0.33, we're looking pretty good. Remember, these are negative values. And this was just our test print. You can always adjust this further on your first actual print, but you're going to be really close. When you're happy with that offset, go ahead and click the button, and that should save to EEPROM. Now remember, we are using the Creality firmware here, but how Creality has this firmware set up, you should not have to add anything additional to your Start G code to get the auto bed leveling to work. Most of the time, the default setting in Marlin, if you run a G28 to home, that's going to reset the mesh that you created. So you'd have to run a G29 again. There are options in Marlin to turn that off, which Creality has probably done. You really don't even need to enable the mesh, but it's probably not a bad idea. So let's take a look at the Start G code anyway, even though with this config you probably don't need to do anything, but you might go ahead and do it anyway, just in case your configuration changes. My main slicer is Prusa Slicer. A lot of the slicers are going to be the same, but in Prusa Slicer you can just go to Printer Settings and then go to Custom G code. Here we're just doing a G28, then I'm doing a prime line. You have a couple of options here. You could either do your home and then go ahead and re-level every time you start a print. A lot of printers do that. It does take a long time, but it might be the best way to ensure you have a correct mesh. All you would have to do is enter a G29 right here. That's going to run that leveling sequence every time and keep that mesh up to date. Now, if you just want to save the mesh, if you're completely happy with the mesh that you ran, it's been working good for you, you shouldn't have to enable it with this firmware because it's already enabled in EEPROM. But just in case it gets disabled, all you would need to do is run an M420 S1 right here. That's going to pull the mesh out of EEPROM and make sure that it gets used. So at the very least, I would go ahead and add this to your Start G code. Not every firmware is going to work the same. We're just using the Creality one, but as we move down the line, as I get closer to actual Marlin, I'll explain how all these features are going to work together. And for bonus points, if you want to make sure your bed is super level, you can actually take the numbers from your bed level output or the ones that are in your EEPROM and check it on a website. So back to Pronterface, you can see here, this is the output from a G29 command. All you have to do is take this and copy it. And there's a couple of good sites out here that you can paste this in and then visualize your bed. So we'll just paste it right here, hit visualize, and here's what our bed looks like. So it's actually pretty good. On the left side, it is a little high, but the nice part about having those bed leveling wheels with auto bed leveling, then you could go back and adjust those wheels to get it as flat as possible. I could definitely stand to bring it down on that left side just a bit. So play around with that. With that said, I think this bed is level enough to get a nice first layer. So with that, let's go ahead and do the full print of our bed leveling pattern and just see how it turns out. So there it is, the Creality Ender 3 version 2. We got the BLTouch installed, we got auto bed leveling enabled, and we updated the firmware. And this is just a stepping off point for me. I wanted to see where Creality was with their firmware, how easy it was to update it, and how the screen comes into play. And there are a lot of different community options for this printer that I want to investigate. But hopefully this will give me some more knowledge to be able to help others out in the comments if they have questions about their V2. So hopefully you found this helpful. That will be it for today, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.